Alright guys, so I had you guys read Jack London's To Build a Fire. It's a part of the beginning of a naturalist movement. So the naturalism movement was sort of a burgeoning movement post-Civil War up through the beginning of the 20th century. And it was a part of realism. So I wanted you guys to kind of see what these different movements entailed. So realism came first. Realism was, again, a reaction against Romanticism. It was sort of detached scientific method point of view of subjects within literature. So whereas Romanticism is heavy in symbolism and metaphors and motifs, naturalism takes this sort of scientific approach, particularly to character development. So characters are results of their situation and their environment. It's how they relate to the environment, how they react to the environment, and what happens in the environment. Again, and this focuses on everyday reality. So it really focuses on the dark, seedy underside of American life, as well as the positive parts. But it really showed what it was like during this post-industrialist revolution, and we have this westward expansion, and life is not idealistic. It's not an ideal. And the characterization really is the most important part of the narrative. So regionality is important. There's vernacular used within a lot of these texts. So, a southern versus a northeastern versus a Midwest type of vernacular. And then again, man here is often fighting against outside forces, whether it's poverty or class issues or nature, and that's where naturalism comes in. It's really hard to sometimes it's hard to distinguish realism from naturalism. They are very much intertwined. So I'm going to call it a derivative of realism, and it focused on the relationship, particularly of man to sort of the wildness of nature, and it often created this focus on survival. And this objective third-person detached tone is really important in these. It's again like a documentary essentially, where it's man versus wild, but there is no sympathy for the plight of man. So this all comes as part of sort of this idea of westward expansion. We're post-manifest destiny at this point. We've had this idea of sort of the divine purpose of American expansion and how we were supposed to and meant to expand to the West Coast. We've done that now. And this is really taking place during the Gold Rush. Again, Lee read in his biography, London was an explorer during the Gold Rush in the Klondike. He had a very adventurous life. And so this is really his explanation and expansion and exploration of what it was truly like in this time to survive in the wilderness against all these forces that were happening, and how survival for man really was a very trying experience in the cold, bitter wilderness in the Klondike. So To Build a Fire, again, begins with this unnamed man, and he's hiking with his dog. He's a husky, of course. And if you've read any of his other stories, you know that London actually personifies from the point of view of the dog in other stories. But here we have this third-person narration of the man and the dog. And what we learned at the beginning is that page 1048 is that the man he's not a creative person. He's a survivalist. He sees the problem in front of him and he attacks it or tries to find the solution. And really, he says that he was without imagination. So there's no deep metaphors here crossing his mind. He says it's not that he's meditating upon the frailty of his life or the frailty of man. No, this is just about man surviving in the wild. It's as simple as that. And this really is a commentary on naturalist literature versus sort of the romantic, oversaturation of sensation that came before. And importantly, the dog is cast in this scenario as this innate creature. So he's had hundreds of years of evolution with instinct and primal nature as protectant, versus that which man has, which is really just 50 years of experience in the Klondike. So he's casting the two as sort of juxtaposed against one another. And he says, the brute had his instinct on 1049, and the dog had learned one thing from the man. It was the dog had learned fire. Fire meant warmth, safety, survival. So that was why he depended on the man. So again, fire is the force that is capable of saving both of these creatures, and they both know it. The only thing is the dog has to depend on the man for fire. And so this relationship is really dichotomized against one another as instinct versus experience, and the man's own arrogance it really gets in his way. So he makes foolish mistakes. He goes to eat his lunch, and he kind of chuckles because he realized on 1051 he forgot to build a fire and thaw out first. Now this is the first step in what's going to lead to his essentially his trek towards death. And what he says is that the man did not know cold, but the dog knew. The man keeps thinking how cold it is. It's very cold. It's very cold. And he's kind of not acknowledging the fact that it's dangerously cold. And the dog itself knows that it's really too cold to be out in the Klondike on their own. It says that he thinks it's 50 below, but really it's 75 below. It's dangerously cold. And another mistake he makes is that he did not travel with somebody else. He was arrogant enough to think he could travel by himself. And this old timer at the store before he left had told him to travel with somebody, and he was so arrogant that he thought, no, I can do this myself. And he has to it's really a matter of listening to your elders and respecting the wisdom that has been passed down. And that's what this man doesn't do. He doesn't respect nature. He doesn't respect the power of nature and the wisdom that's been gained by man in exploring the Klondike. So ultimately he makes a mistake, and he builds this fire, and he's so arrogant he thinks, I've done it myself. On 1053 he says, well, here he was, he says, they told me I shouldn't travel alone. Well, here he was, he had the accident, he was alone, he had fallen through the snow into the ice, and he had saved himself. So he built this fire. And all of a sudden, we have this issue where the fire goes out because the bough above him, he built it under a tree, which he should never do. He should build it out in the open. The smoke had risen enough to melt the snow enough that it actually caved in and snuffed out the fire. And this is a deadly mistake. And so this relationship between the dog and the man really comes into play here. The dog and the man work together, but there's really no innate loyalty. He says, he sends the dog out ahead of him to try and test the ice, and the dog falls through. He helps save the dog because he needs the dog, but it's not because he has a loyalty to the dog, and the dog does not have a loyalty to him. So the man breaks through the ice. He's keenly aware of this danger, and then after he snuffs out the fire, this really and truly, he says, it was as though he had just heard his own sentence of death on 1053. He knows that this means death. The dog knows on some sense that that the fire means life. So it's a really interesting juxtaposition to make. And the dog realizes he can't depend on what he calls the fire provider. And the man starts to sort of lose his mind, and he feels this incredible surge of envy against the dog on 1054. And he says, he has this idea that he's heard this crazy thing where, because he attempts over and over and over to light the matches, and at one point he lights the matches and they all catch on fire on 1055, all 70 matches all at once, and he's holding them desperately trying to light the birchwood, and he realizes that his own flesh is on fire, but he can't feel it, and eventually it burns so deep that he can feel it, and so he has to let it go, and the fire is snuffed out. And even though the birch is on fire, he tries to get it all to work, and it eventually just goes out. And he realizes that this means that he's facing death. And the dog realizes it too. It says on 1055 that the fire provider had failed. And so he starts calling the dog because he remembers this thing he had heard about if he puts his hands inside the dead animal to warm them up. So he's going to kill the dog, use him to survive. And again, this is like a documentary, so there's no emotion in this. But the dog, using its instinct, has apprehension of him. He hears this note of fear and this note of desperation that he's never heard before, and he's very wary of it. So the man eventually does get the dog. He kind of stands up and feels more like himself, and so the note of fear is gone. And he realizes that he can't kill the dog because he can't feel his fingers. So he has his arms around him, and he can't do it. He has no physical way to do it. So he lets the dog go, and he says at this point there's a fear of death that comes to him, and it's a matter of life and death with the chances against him. And it was a fear as he had never known in his life. And so he starts running, literally running, thinking he can make it back to the camp. And he realizes at some point that he doesn't have the endurance and he can't. So ultimately on 57, he decides that he's going to accept death with dignity. And so he's just going to go to sleep, and he has all these visions of them finding his body, and this sort of slow descent into death takes place, and he just falls asleep and freezes to death. And the dog at the end, it's kind of waiting on him and looking to him, and finally it goes closer and it sniffs the smell of death on him. And he bristles and backs away and realizes that this is no longer an option. And so he runs off to find the camp where he knows instinctually where it is, where there is food providers and fire providers. So this story is really just a straightforward exploration of what survival is. There's not a lot of heavy metaphors. There is this really interesting relationship between the dog and man, and really the powerlessness of man against nature, and the arrogance of man when he makes a mistake is what is his downfall. If he had either just listened to the wisdom of the Klondike and the people who had survived the Klondike for so many years, or if he had been more attuned to sort of the instinctual surroundings, just like the dog was, and listened to instinct rather than experience, he might have survived. So hopefully you see how these stories kind of fit with this idea of naturalism and this detached viewpoint, and hopefully you really enjoyed Jack London.